So let's start off about talking about the Constitutional Convention. So one of the first things we need to talk about is that um, why are they calling for a new constitution? Well, that goes back to what we've talked about, which is the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And by the summer of 1787, there are so many people that are upset about some of the way the country's going and the Articles of Confederation and the weaknesses that they have that they call for a constitutional convention to make changes to the Articles of Confederation. Of course, one of the first things they do is not really start talking about making changes, but start with a completely new constitution altogether. That is very controversial. There's a lot of people that say, wait a second, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. Men like Patrick Henry, men like Thomas Jefferson were concerned about what was going on at this constitutional convention. So here at Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed, is also where they come together to meet for this constitutional convention. And there's really a who's who of Americans that show up. I'm not going to tell a whole bunch about each person, but I am want to talk about a few people. One of them, obviously, George Washington. He is really important for this convention because there were a lot of people that were, as I said, were kind of worried about this constitutional convention. What are these people doing here? What are they coming here? We already have a constitution. We call it the Articles of Confederation. What's going on? Why are they meeting? So there was a lot of apprehension and nervousness about it. Well, then when George Washington agrees and says, yes, I'll attend, I'll be a Virginia delegate, well, that eases many people's minds because if George Washington's willing to be a part of it, we love and trust George Washington, it must be okay. Ben Franklin is there. James Madison is there. James Madison is a Virginia delegate as well, and he comes to the convention prepared with a plan of government. And we'll talk about that plan in just a few minutes. Alexander Hamilton, a close advisor to George Washington, is there. John Dickinson, Roger Sherman, a couple of key people that weren't there. John Adams, who is a diplomat, U.S. diplomat to Great Britain, and Thomas Jefferson, who is U.S. diplomat to France. So neither one of them are there. So some of the key differences throughout the country, one of them is population. We've got large states and small states, and those differences are going to show up in the controversies and the problems they have to solve to try to come up with a new constitution. Another key difference is going to be northern states versus southern states. Now, it's not so much that they are in the north and the south specifically, it's more that what does that mean as far as their economies? The northern states and the southern states have different economies, and that's based on the geography, based on the area, the geography of the place. And so in the north, you have more manufacturing and trade. You have more free labor. It's not completely free. There are slaves in northern states, but it's generally more free. There's not, the economy is not as dependent upon slave labor in the north, and it is more urban. And then in the south, we have agricultural plantation economy, um, much more heavily dependent on slave labor and predominantly rural. So James Madison comes with the Virginia Plan, and it created three branches of government, which is a change from the Articles of Confederation. If you remember, the Articles of Confederation did not have an executive branch. It did not have a judicial branch. It did have a legislative branch, but it was unicameral. And so these are some of the changes that Madison comes with. One, let's have an executive branch. Let's have somebody to enforce the laws. Let's have a bicameral or a two-house legislature, and representation is going to be based on population. So bigger states like Virginia will have more representatives, and smaller states like New Jersey will have fewer representatives. This is a change from the Articles of Confederation, because if you'll remember the Articles of Confederation, every state got one vote. And then let's also have a judicial branch to solve problems between the states and to basically administer justice so for the laws that are passed, the federal laws that are passed. The large states favor the Virginia plan. They like the plan. But the New Jersey plan, a smaller state comes up with another plan because they're not big fans of the Virginia plan. It does create three branches of government, so they agree, hey, we need an executive, we need a judicial branch, but the key difference is the legislative branch. And in the New Jersey plan, the legislative branch would be unicameral, or one house. And each state would get one vote. And so this is more like the Articles of Confederation. And this position that the New Jersey plan takes is reflects the belief that states were independent entities, and this is the assumption that the Articles of Confederation kind of were created under. Is hey, we're 13 independent countries almost, and we freely joined the United States of America, but we still remain largely independent, and so that's why under the Articles of Confederation you don't have an executive, you don't have a judicial, because they didn't want that. They wanted each state to basically be its own nation. Well, the changes that they want to make under this new constitution, especially the New Jersey plan, don't reflect that idea as much. The idea is more that hey, we're going to be more tightly bound together. We're going to have a more powerful central government. The New Jersey plan is kind of a stepping away from that a little bit. It's going to be more powerful than the Articles of Confederation, but not as powerful as perhaps the Virginia plan would have made it. The small states favor this because, and the big thing here is that the small states favor it because they retain just an equal vote to the large states. So their voice is just as loud as Virginia or any of the other large states. The large states don't like it because their voice is equal to a smaller state. So their citizens have not as big a say in the government because there's more people there and they're only getting one representative still. So the big point of contention here is obviously with the legislative branch. The Virginia plan says representation is based on population. New Jersey plan says each state gets one vote. So what are we going to do? Well, we come up with what is known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut plan. It kept three branches of government. Both of them had that. But in the legislative branch, it's going to be bicameral like the Virginia plan states. But in the lower house, the House of Representatives, representation is going to be based on population. This is what the large states want. This is what the Virginia plan said. But the upper house, the Senate, each state will have equal representation. And so each state will get to elect 2 senators, and the small states prefer this. So you see the compromise. Large states get part of what they want, small states get part of what they want. And so it turns out to be a pretty good compromise. People feel pretty good about it, and it passes. The next big issue we have is the 3/5 compromise. And northern states did not want to count toward slaves to count toward representation in Congress. So if we have to decide, we have to figure out how many people are in each state. We have to have a census, count how many people are in each state, and depending upon the number of people you have, that affects the number of representatives you have in the House of Representatives. The larger states get more representatives, smaller states, fewer representatives. Well, are we going to count slaves toward this? That's the question at hand. Well, northern states do not want to count slaves toward representation in Congress, do not want to count them for the population because they're not getting to vote, they're not considered citizens, so why would we count them towards representation in Congress? The southern states said, no, well, yeah, we're not going to let them vote. They're not going to have a voice in the government, but they should count towards Congress because they're part of our population, and that would help the southern states because that would give them more representatives. So what they end up doing is agreeing on a 3/5 ratio. Every 5 slaves would count as 3 people towards the population. The result, well, overrepresentation and therefore more power in southern states. So in 1793, southern states had 47 seats in the House of Representatives instead of the 33 that their population would have really said that they should have had. Their free population, their voting population would have given them. By 1812, they have 76 votes instead of 59. 1833, 98 votes instead of 73. And so this is significant. This is an overrepresentation. This gives them more power in the House of Representatives than they normally would have had. Then we have the slave trade compromise. So the new Constitution gave Congress power to regulate trade, which is a difference that did not exist under the prior government, under the Articles of Confederation. And so people are starting to say, well, what's going to happen to the slave trade? If they can regulate trade, they can put a tax on importation of slaves, they can do things like that. That's going to cause a problem for us. So northern states, they're already, many of them are ready. We want to ban the slave trade, or at least, in theory we could. So southern states recognize this and say, no, you're not going to do that. So northerners agreed that they could not outlaw the slave trade for 20 years. They basically said, we promise we won't do that for 20 years. Now, this note, one key thing to recognize here, this is not saying banning slavery. It's simply banning the importing of slaves from other countries. So slaves would no longer be allowed to be brought into the nation. There's only the slaves that are here or that are born here would be able to be slaves. We could not bring in more slaves. Northerners end up agreeing to this, and they could not stop fugitive slaves from being returned as well. So those are the key compromises at the Constitutional Convention and the key issues that we're going to be looking at over this week.